So welcome to this fourth session, this term of work looking at being interrupted by Al Barrett and Ruth Harley. We've looked at the book for the last 3 weeks, and I'm glad to say Al and Ruth are here with us today to answer questions and to be led in discussion by Liz Shercliffe. But before we begin, let's just have a prayer and a moment of quiet. And the prayer adapted from Augustine of Hippo. Lord Jesus, let me know myself and know you, and desire nothing save only you. Let me do everything for the sake of you. Let me humble myself and exalt you. Let me think of nothing except you. Let me die to myself and live in you. Let me cling to nothing save only to you, and let me be poor because of you. Look upon me that I may love you, call me that I may see you, and forever enjoy you. Amen.
Amen.
And so Liz, over to you.
Okay, thanks. It's a great pleasure to have Al and Ruth with us today. We've been looking at the book for 3 weeks now, and for my money, it's a book that contributes something really new and important to the field of mission, and one of the things the church has been really interested in discussing. So I hope that you've all come with some questions. I've got some to begin with to kick us off with. But just quick introduction, Al is Vicar of Hodge Hill in Birmingham, where you've been for about 20 years or something, haven't you? A long time. And also a researcher at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham and a speaker on matters of mission and inclusion. And Ruth is curate in Milton Keynes, and you describe yourself as an ecclesiologist, a feminist, and a charismatic Catholic. I think I've got that right. So is that straight from your Twitter feed? So it should be right. So both of you, if you'd like to take turns in answering this, maybe. Tell us a bit more about what being interrupted means to you. It's quite a provocative title, isn't it? Who's going first? You're both muted. Yeah, Ruth, you're going first.
I'm going first, great. Yeah, I suppose it is a bit of a provocative title, yeah. And I think one of the things that it encapsulates for me is something which, in its more kind of academic form, we speak about as radical receptivity, so that openness to receiving from the other. And I think being interrupted for me really epitomizes that. And it's, for me, there's something important in the being interrupted, that it's I think that's one of the things that's been really important for us, both in what we say in the book, but also in the process of writing the book. It was quite an interrupted process to write in all sorts of ways, both intentional and unintentional. It's a little bit of a hostage to fortune, as we are discovering, because every time anything unexpected happens, someone will go, being interrupted. But I think for me, at the heart of things, it's about saying we're not in control, we're not in charge, because God is. And that for me is a really important, for God to break through in whatever ways God does, and to be interrupted. Al?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the entirely unplanned and unengineered things that happened while we were writing it was a global pandemic hit, and an interruption suddenly became the frame within which all of life was experienced in some ways. And I guess, I mean, that was an unfortunate coincidence, but what it did help us with was we'd already begun thinking through what it might be like if church particularly was interrupted in more or less dramatic ways. So I guess that's one level that it's been important and feels like it continues to be important. But I think I wanted to flag up a couple of other levels as well. So I I first began to use the language of being interrupted when I became a parent, and discovering life with one and then two young children, and realizing, I think probably for the first time in my life, that actually my agenda being interrupted by someone else, particularly someone who in all kinds of ways had less power than I did, could potentially not just be an annoyance, but actually could open my mind and my world up to all kinds of things that I'd never seen before. And so that, you know, that was quite a world-changing moment for me. And I think probably one of the more sort of definite moments of that kind of experience happening, that particularly in the years since then, and my oldest child is 13 now, actually I've begun to process more and more in relation to some of the other facets of my identity, and most of you will have spotted that that I'm white, that I'm male, that I'm solidly middle class in background and kind of ongoing kind of habits of life in many ways, as well as being straight and non-disabled, and a number of other factors as well. And I think that sense of kind of being aware that some of those aspects of privilege can very often come with a sense that my agenda is just assumed to be the one that prevails, and actually discovering that if we begin to open ourselves, or if people like me begin to open ourselves to the possibility of my agenda being interrupted and disrupted by others, then actually that is both uncomfortable, but also opens up a wonderful, wider, bigger, more diverse, more interesting world.
Thank you. I'm going to reframe a question that is similar to one somebody asked last week, which is how you talk a lot about who's excluded, but how are people who are male, white, middle class, etc., supposed to respond to the challenges that are in the book?
Shall I pick that up first, Ruth? And then
Yeah, I defer to my male white middle class colleague on this one.
This does not happen very often. Or we make sure it doesn't, but yeah, on this one it kind of feels like it should be me. So I think one of the guiding phrases behind a lot of the way I try and live my life these days, and certainly kind of underneath the book, is a phrase that probably a lot of you have heard and probably even used. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Mm-hmm. That sense in which, for some of us, we have lived for however many years of our life in a world that actually in many ways is built around people like us, and that is kind of comfortable for people like us. But of course, it's more complex than that, isn't it? Because we all have multiple layers of identity. And actually, for most of us, I suspect some of those layers carry some structural privilege with them. And some of our layers don't. And of course, so that experience kind of depends on our situation to a great extent, depends on the particular context or relationship that we're in, whether we are actually the person with more structural privilege and power or not. If I was sitting in a room with Boris Johnson, for example, I suspect he would probably outdo me on at least a number of factors. Nevertheless, I think it's become increasingly important for me to acknowledge those layers of privilege. And I think one of the things I'm becoming increasingly aware of is something about limits in there. Actually learning that being human means living within limits. And that sounds like a really obvious thing to say, I think. But for people like me who are white and middle class and male, amongst other things, we have so often been told you can do anything, you can go anywhere, you can sit in any room and be heard, and so on and so on. And actually discovering that actually many of my siblings and my neighbours don't have that experience, actually have no choice but to feel boxed in various ways by the world, encourages me to discover that there are limits to what actually I can, as a human being in relationship with other human beings, do and say and be. But I think I just want to twist that a little bit and then shut up, because actually that's one of the things that I'm learning. The other side of discovering the need to live within limits is also, as I said already, actually discovering our world dramatically expanded, because we discovered that a whole load of other people see the world differently to us. And only by realizing that I have limits to how I see the world, are my horizons opened to begin to see the world through other people's eyes, and to begin to hear experiences very different to mine. And at that point, I will practice what I preach and stop talking.
Yeah, and I think in that there's something, as we discover the limits of our own situatedness. We are all in some way situated in the world. That's what it is to be human, to be a creature. As we discover our own kind of creaturely situatedness, and we discover therefore the multiple differences and the others to us who we encounter, we also see a broader picture of who God is. Because we need all of our limited perspectives to get us anywhere near to approaching the fullness of who God is. There's something really fundamental and important there. And I think the other thing I'd want to add is that there's something important to note that's relational about privilege. So it's not a kind of binary. We don't want to set up a binary. Well, you've either got privilege or you've not on this axis, that axis, or the other. Human beings don't work like that. We're all complex, multifaceted people. The quote that we use at the start of Being Interrupted from Gloria Steinem, I think is really good. I've not got it in front of me, but I think it goes something along the lines of, if you have more power than the person you're talking to, you need to listen as much as you speak. And if you have less power, you need to speak as much as you listen. Both are difficult. And for me, that really encapsulates a lot about what we're trying to get at in terms of kind of how privilege functions and how those power dynamics function in church as well as in society more broadly.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the audience then? Yeah, Jane.
Sorry, I've read the book, and this is not a criticism at all. I'm still not quite clear what you're hoping to achieve. I get widening horizons, reimagining. I'm not quite sure what the church's mission is actually, that you're reimagining. And I get raising awareness of being in other people's shoes, of the wider world. What are you hoping that will happen if people read this book then at the end of it?
That's actually really encouraging. Thank you, Jane, because bizarrely. So one of the things we always say when we talk about the book, I think almost without exception, we've said this at pretty much everything we've spoken about, is this book isn't going to give people an answer to, well, what next? Or here's how to do it, or here's what we want to achieve out of it. It's very much more about kind of opening up, but continuing a conversation that's already there. We often speak about the book as a point in a conversation. Obviously, it's a conversation between me and Al. It's also a conversation between us and our local context in Hodge Hill. And it's a conversation into which we've drawn a quite eclectic range of other thinkers and speakers and writers in what we've read and used. But it's a point in a conversation. It's a conversation that's been going on forever, really, and will continue. And what we hope is that if it does anything for people, it's a book that makes people ask different questions from what they might have asked before. We're very clear, we haven't got an end point, you know, if everyone read this book and did this, it would be like this and that would be great. That's just not how we see it functioning at all. It's, yeah, if people get to the end of it and they have a question in their mind about what it means to be church in the world that they didn't have in their minds before they read it, or a different nuance to how they're approaching a question, then that's job done, really, as far as we're concerned, I think. For me, anyway. Al, what do you want to say on that?
So I think, I mean, the questions around what church should be like and what mission means and how we should do mission now seem to be everywhere in the church at the moment. But I think one of my frustrations, I guess, at its most pointed, has often been that actually that conversation feels quite fragmented, that it's often not a joined up conversation, and that people are often talking past each other in that conversation because actually they mean quite different things by church and by mission. And so I think one of the things that we're wanting to do is to be a contribution to that conversation that might help do just a little bit of that joining up. And I guess in one particular area, and that particular area is how we engage with our neighbours at a local neighbourhood level, which I think is a really important part of how we understand church and mission, but is certainly not the only way that people talk about church and mission. And I think what we've been wanting to do is name at least, so we talk about economies of mission, and we don't mean by that just where money is and where money goes in the world, but that's part of it. We mean more the kind of, you know, what shapes our imaginations? How do we think it works? And I think what we're wanting to do, amongst other things, is name what we see as a couple of the dominant economies of mission in the world that we know, and particularly in the Church of England, in England. And those two dominant economies, and briefly, most of you will probably have engaged with this stuff already, the economy of counting in, and that sense of kind of there's a gap at the heart of the church that needs filling by people or by money or by both, and the economy of giving out, which is that sense of kind of, you know, there's so much need in the world and we as church need to be sort of filling that gap, responding to that need. And I think we're wanting to say, amongst other things, that both of those are important, but actually we see a lot of anxiety around in the institution of the church at the moment, that kind of is focused on one or other of those economies. And one of the things that we're wanting to do is just point to a space that maybe is a little bit liberated from some of those institutional anxieties, where actually we can think about church and mission and our neighbours differently.
Thank you. Any other questions at the moment? Jenny.
Yeah, you're really reflexive in the book, in that you know your own standpoints and you're really honest about those and where you're coming from. How important is that reflexivity for those of us who are ministering in churches, and how do we encourage it in one another if it is important?
That's a brilliant question, Jenny. I think we would say that reflexivity is absolutely crucial. And I think one of the things that we're wanting to say in the book particularly is that when we have any kind of power in our relationships, if we are not kind of constantly engaging in those processes of self-critical reflection, that understands our own locatedness and our own identity, in relation to those we're engaging with, then the danger is that we abuse our power without even knowing that we're doing it. And I know, I don't want to set you up, Ruth, but some of your recent work has been around safeguarding particularly, hasn't it? And where power fits in within that. Maybe you might want to say something about that.
Mm. Yeah, I think I would echo what Al says. I think my answer to how important is reflexivity in all this is essential. I think knowing ourselves and our own situatedness is really important. One of the influences that has really been really strong for me is Carter Hayward's work on the hermeneutic of particularity, is her phrase, by which she means we all come at the world and at God and at one another and at the Bible from a particular point of view and as a particular person. And that it's only by really thoroughly owning that we can really see what it is we can see, if that makes sense. Yeah, and acknowledging one another's particularity is really, really essential, I think. And I think this thing about power, there is a degree of privilege involved in being able to live an unexamined life. Like, there's, you know, if you're a man, then perhaps you can walk through life without realizing that patriarchy is there, but you can't if you're a woman because it's there. And if, like me, you are a white person, you can maybe walk through life choosing not to notice the racism that surrounds us. But my Black friends don't have that privilege. They know that they are situated in relation to a racist society. I am also situated in relation to a racist society, but I could choose to ignore that. I could choose to be oblivious to that, and it is a choice not to be. So obliviousness is one of the words that we use quite a bit in the book, to name that kind of, I think the phrase is power-related willingness not to see. And it's only when we see power that we can use it safely. Yeah, I think there's sometimes a rush in the church to say, oh, we don't really have power, you know, servant leadership, and we lay it all down and all this kind of thing. But actually, particularly those of us who are ordained, but others in positions of responsibility in the church as well, we do have power. And we, you know, not unbridled power, thank goodness, but we do have power, and we have a responsibility to examine how we use it. And it is when we don't acknowledge our own relationship to power and our own power involving relationships to other people that we get really awful situations arising at the most extreme. And yeah, Al's alluded to some of my work around safeguarding, and one of the things that has come out of that is the extent to which unexamined power and unexamined situatedness of people in relation to each other contributes to the church's safeguarding failures again and again and again. But on a really everyday level, I think when we don't examine who we are and how we are related and situated in relationship to our neighbour, even if, you know, most of us are not day-to-day perpetuating those kinds of abuses of power, thank goodness, but sometimes we are failing to see who our neighbour really is because we're not examining our relationship with them, or we're not examining our own situatedness in relation to them. And there's something really important about seeing people for who they are, in terms of seeing the image of God in them. And I think that starts with seeing ourselves for who we are.
Thank you. Any other questions at the moment? Can you, can each of you give a kind of example from your current parish or your current ministry of how the mission of the church has been interrupted by the community in which it sits, and that's been beneficial for what you see as the ministry, as the mission and the ministry of the church?
In my experience, most of the examples are really quite small. And I think there's something significant in that. So just to give you one from the past year, in the midst of the first lockdown, when we as church were not gathering physically in any sense, when we were both as church and as wider neighbourhood mourning the closure of all the places where we would normally bump into each other during the week and share food together. In a little patch of woodland in the middle of the First and Bromford estate on which I live, that much of which looks a bit grey on a superficial glance, in a little patch of woodland, a table and chairs appeared, a dining table and chairs. And for a couple of days on the neighbourhood Facebook group, it was just noticed that, you know, this was slightly odd. But then after that, on the table started appearing plates and cutlery and glasses and mugs, and then there was a kind of chandelier hung from one of the branches above the table. And then someone put a jar with lots of pieces of paper and a couple of pens in, and invited people to kind of write what they were thankful for and put it in the jar. And over the weeks that followed, there were all kinds of additions to this place, many of them really quite creative, kind of pictures hung from trees and the like. And you know, it may be that you've experienced similar in your neighbourhoods where you are, but this became a sacred space, and it became a place of gathering without gathering, if that makes sense. You know, there was a sense of community and fellowship around that place, even if at any one time there were only 2 or 3 people there. And when we as a church began to be a bit more kind of beginning to think, you know, how is church going to work in this next phase, discovering that lockdown is, you know, not just a week or 2, but actually, you know, was clearly going to take over life for quite a while. Doing church in the woods became one of the special sacred spaces of gathering for us, and of reconnecting not just with each other, but with God through the environment around us, and not just what we might call the natural environment there, although that was, you know, that was immensely enriching and awe-inspiring in many ways, but also the environment as other human beings around us had added creativity to. So yeah.
Thanks.
I was just thinking as Al was speaking there, and actually I'm going to answer your question of can I give an example of this from my current context with no. So I've been in my current context for 3 months. And I think one of the things that I really want to flag up about this being interrupted kind of way of church is that it's slow. It moves, one of the phrases we use in the book is moving at the speed of trust. 3 months isn't long enough to build relationships of trust with people, actually. And particularly in a fairly large parish like this one is, with many separate, quite discrete communities, it takes time. So I really feel like actually 3 months in, I'm still very much in a listening phase here. But I have been surprised by some of the things that I've heard. I've asked open questions and the answers haven't always been what I thought they were going to be. And one of my favourite lines in scripture is the bit where Mary is described as pondering all these things in her heart. And that's kind of what it feels like at the moment, is that kind of gathering up of things and pondering them, turning them over and not rushing into, well, here's the thing I could do with that. So we did have a little unexpected interruption the other week. I was just tidying up after church one Sunday, and a young woman I'd never met before came into the building carrying the most enormous kind of floral display. Like I could barely see her behind it. And I said, hello, you know, can I said, and of course I said that thing we all say, can I help you? Which was a ridiculous thing to say, but I said it. And the answer was no, I couldn't, but she could help us, as it turns out. She's a young woman learning to be a florist, and she lives around the corner, and she didn't really want an enormous floral display in her house, and would we like it for church? Well, yes, we'd love it, thanks very much. We'll pop it over here, that's so kind. We had lovely chats, you know, and off she went. And I think one of the hazards of a being interrupted mindset is rushing too quickly to gather the things that we are interrupted by back into something we control. So, you know, I could have followed that up with, and would you like to join the flower rota? Or, you know, oh, why don't we have a flower festival? Or you know, whatever it was, but I didn't. And I don't know whether that'll turn into anything. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I saw her in Sainsbury's the other day and we waved. We'll see what happens. But I think moving slowly and not accepting the gifts that we're offered for what they are, rather than trying to rush to corral them into something we'd like them to be, is a really important part of how we do a being interrupted kind of being church.
I might have misunderstood some of this, but it seems to me that listening to both of you talk about mission and building relationships, there's something that's a lot less pressured about that than some of the answers that we, you know, the off the peg answers to mission or other attitudes to mission. I mean, Al, I remember a few years ago you speaking quite passionately about your impression of churches that are planted to reach into areas where there's been a church for ages, and you both seem much more stress-free. You might not be stress-free, but you seem more stress-free than that.
I think, yeah, I mean, I talked a bit about that sense of institutional anxiety earlier that we sense is around and want, in a sense, to bring to the surface and name. Because it feels like actually if we name it and acknowledge it, then we can begin to do something differently. And I do, or we do, I think, genuinely feel that there is something of God in small and slow and fragile, that actually does go to what we would see as the heart of who God is, and of what the gospel is about. And actually, some of this is just about kind of adjusting the lenses through which we see, to look for the small and the slow and the fragile, and to be thankful for it, be receptive of the gifts that it offers, celebrate it, and at best nurture it, but nurture it not to turn it into something that it's not, you know, not to turn small into big, not to turn fragile into robust and resilient, not to turn slow into fast and efficient, but actually, and language almost fails me, I think, but to nurture that kind of ground as it is, and the life that offers, and that feels to me, I think, really close to the heart of what we're called to be about as Christians.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'd want to slightly extend that metaphor by saying, notice that Al used the word nurture there, which is a very different word from cultivate. When we think about we use growing metaphors all the time about churches, don't we, when we talk about church growth? And often they are metaphors of cultivation. Whether we use that word or not, they're metaphors of growing something into what we want it to be. And I think what we're wanting to say is that kind of nurturing that Al's describing there is more connected with what in the book we name as wilding or rewilding. So letting go of control and allowing things to grow the way that they grow, or not, as the case may be, and accepting that part of that process of growth, of wilded and wilding growth, is that things decompose. Decomposition is part of growth. things die, they decompose, and that decomposition is the stuff of life. We need it. Resurrection from the compost heap is one of the many metaphors that we use about resurrection in the book. And I think there's something that we really try to hold on to there. And I think holding on to that, and it's all part of kind of resisting that institutional anxiety of, well, we must grow, or we must do this, or we must do that. Part of that is with something we've almost named today, which is being rooted in abundance rather than scarcity. So both of those, counting in and sending out a kind of economies of church, they're both rooted in scarcity. Either scarcity within the church, so we must get more in, or scarcity among our neighbours, so we must give more out. And when instead we try to look at the world with an assumption of abundance, it completely changes the way we see things. Yeah, but slowly. It's not an overnight transformation. It's a slow thing.
Thank you. Jane Jones.
I think the biggest interruption is COVID itself, and closing all the buildings has had such a profound effect, and it's made me certainly think outside the building and to reach out in a way. I mean, to see all these people on the screen, Al talked about a different way of seeing. I'm seeing people who wouldn't be part of this group if it had carried on being the cosy, lovely little group it used to be inside the cathedral. I'm sure some of you wouldn't have travelled into the cathedral, and it's extended our range of people who are able to take part in the talks and the discussions and so on. And people have responded brilliantly in ways of coping with it, but it challenges this view that the church is a building. And, it challenges this view that the church is a particular community that's been built up over, in the cathedral's case, 900 years, and it's made us think very differently. And I think that is the biggest literal interruption, a slam dunk, and we're all outside the building.
Yeah. And we've got about 2 minutes, I think. Just briefly for Al and Ruth, what would you like the new normal to be like for the church, for churches in England and for the Church of England?
2 minutes. I mean, I think I'm going to again start by saying I don't know, and I think that's really important. I think it's really important that it is something that we don't go into assuming that we know what it's going to look like. I think for me, I would hope that it will be, whatever it is, will be created in a sort of co-creating way, not in an imposed way, and that it'll be something that reflects the diversity of who people are and where we are, that it'll be something that is attentive to its context and attentive to those who are often ignored or neglected, that it'll be something that delights in discovering the abundance of small, slow gifts in our midst, in the way that God delights in discovering all our small, slow, faltering abundances.
Thank you.
I'm almost tempted to just say nothing because Ruth said it really well, but if you want me to say something, Maurice Glassman, about 18 months ago, Lord Glassman, a Labour peer, said one of the choices we have at the moment is between Lenin's question, which is what is to be done, and Marvin Gaye's question, which is what's going on. And one of my hopes for the church in this next phase is that we continue to ask Marvin Gaye's question more than we ask Lenin's.
Yeah, and Monica's just commented that we need to ask about accessibility to our buildings as well, because it's all very well saying people need to come into the building, but if they can't get in, then that's not possible, is it? Jane, were you going to ask a question as well?
I'm only to broaden it out a little bit to say that there's also the aspect of God being a God of interruptions. If you think of Moses and the burning bush, Saul on the road to Damascus, the interruption of a woman anointing Jesus' feet, and probably our own lives here in front of us. There would have been interruptions too in our lives where God has interrupted us and we've gone a different way. But that's only another aspect. God, you can't put God in a box. It was just to throw that in the ring.
Yeah, I think it might as well stay with you, Jane, because we're on 10 to.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you so much, Ruth and Al, for coming. That was really super. Great to have you after having 3 sessions. Next week, we start the session of 4 series on different theologies. And next week is Black theology. And Professor Anthony Reddy is going to come and talk to us next Wednesday. Then we have a gap because it's half term. And then we have 3 other different theologies, which include trauma theology, eco-theology, and feminist theology, not in that order. So look forward to seeing you next week, and good to see you all today. Thank you so much, Al and Ruth. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Ruth.